Last summer, I explored every timeline where Dipper and Mabel from Gravity Falls died, and ever since then, I wanted to do the same kind of deep dive for other animated series. And you already know Steven Universe had to be next in line. The happy ending Steven and his friends achieved often causes fans to forget that the Crystal Gems had a run-in with death many times. So today, I want to run through every timeline where the Crystal Gems died, or at least lost against Homeworld, detailing the consequences of every scenario as a result. With the help of Future Vision, or I guess Past Vision, I'm going to give you all the answers. The first timeline we have is actually pretty early on in the series, with the laser light cannon bad ending, where the Red Eye was rapidly approaching Earth with the goal of monitoring any potential gem activity. If Steven failed to retrieve the light cannon, this escapade could have had two negative outcomes. One, it collides with the planet and kills everyone as it wipes Beach City off the map, which the gems were afraid of happening, dooming the planet as Steven couldn't connect with the cluster and prevent it from emerging, which would hand Homeworld an unstoppable geo-weapon. Or two, it doesn't collide with Earth and instead simply detects that there are at least 5 gems on the planet, and that's only if it failed to pick up on the corrupted and imprisoned gems, something that would probably bump up the number to an alarming count for Homeworld. With direct confirmation that gems are still present on Earth, the grief-stricken Diamonds would have either sent soldiers to bring the crystal gems to them and subsequently have them shattered, or they would have just shown up themselves to finish the job. Either way, the crystal gems would have been cooked long before Steven knew the truth about his mom, and thus would have lacked his trump card of, hey, I'm basically Pink Diamond, to get the other diamonds to back off. Although we don't know if the Red Eye only observes a number of gems present at a location, or if it can detect specific types of gems. If it's the latter, then it's possible it would have scanned Steven as Pink Diamond, which could have led to an even messier situation, being mistaken for his mom when he only had a fraction of the character development, getting taken back to Homeworld and raised by the Diamonds, with the gems being spared thanks to being his friends, but Garnet can no longer exist. Ruby and Sapphire are diffused full-time and separated. Amethyst is stationed at the zoo, and Greg is kept as a pet. Unfortunately, Connie has yet to meet Steven, so she's probably doomed. The Earth is either completed as a colony, or the Diamonds decide to proceed with the cluster, destroying the planet as a whole. The crystal gems cease to exist. All the corrupted gems are lost with the planet, and Steven is forced to act as his mom for the rest of eternity. Yeah, bad ending. Speaking of moms, Mother's Day is fast approaching and you still might be on the hunt for the perfect gift. If you ask me, she deserves something that's stylish yet functional, which is where Raycon's everyday earbuds come into play. Raycon's everyday earbuds are the perfect gift for moms everywhere. Hitting the gym? She can pop in these Raycons and enjoy their premium sound. Does she need to take a phone call while bringing in groceries? With the everyday earbuds, she can ditch putting it on speaker and keep her phone safe in her pocket. Their latest model is the best one yet, with a 32-hour battery life and multi-point connectivity that allows you to pair 2 devices at once. It comes in handy for someone who's constantly using their computer and smartphone like myself. These earbuds come with active noise cancellation, which is hard to find at a reasonable price point, but Raycon starts at just half the price as other premium audio brands, which is pretty incredible in these trying times. The noise cancellation is crazy good too. It's like a mute button for the outside world, which is great for a hardworking mom who needs to tune out the noise and unwind for a moment. At the same time, they also have awareness mode, which I'm a big fan of. It uses the mic to let you hear your surroundings without disrupting your audio. It's been pretty handy for getting my steps in. Speaking of the outdoors, I adore how sturdy and reliable the everyday earbuds are. My phone might fall out of my pocket during a sprint, but the earbuds stay firmly in my ear no matter how fast I'm running. I should also mention that these are, no joke, the most comfortable earbuds I've worn in my life. I usually get an earache or some type of irritation from earbuds, but these feel so nice that I forget they're in half the time. Raycon's everyday earbuds offer a nice palette of vibrant colors to suit your mom's style as well. I'm pretty big on the purple. There's also these cool protective case covers. I rock the Galaxy design because I love things that are space themed, and they support wireless charging. So the protective cover doesn't even have to be taken off to get 90 minutes of battery and just 10 minutes of charging. Again, they're stylish and functional. Your mom will love the Raycon everyday earbuds, and if she doesn't, they offer a 30-day happiness guarantee return policy. No questions asked. Go to buyraycon.com/table to get up to 20% off site-wide. That's right, you'll get 20% off everything on Raycon's website, including 20% off all headphones too, when you go to buyraycon.com/table. Thank you Raycon for sponsoring this video. Next up, we have the serious Steven bad ending. Steven has some close calls inside the pyramid, namely when he almost fell into lava before being rescued by Garnet. If her future vision failed in this moment and she didn't catch him, this would have been little old Steven's final adventure. Steven dying prior to the events of an indirect kiss means that Rose's fountain would have never been reactivated, so if Garnet, Amethyst, or Pearl would have had their gems cracked after this point, it would have been game over. He also would have never met Connie or freed Lapis. A ton of significant events would have never happened. But we'll touch on all of that throughout the video, don't worry. Side note, I've always found it interesting how all the gems survived the temple's explosion at the end without the use of Steven's bubble. So Many Birthdays was one of the first episodes to really signal to the audience that this show was capable of going to some dark places. As Steven himself acknowledges in Growing Pains, this was a traumatic event in his childhood as he almost turned so old that he died. There's a timeline where if Garnet, Amethyst, and Pearl weren't able to piece together that his gem is reacting to his mental state, he would have continued to feel so old and unlike himself that he died right then and there. Dead Steven. By the way, I do think if Steven dies of old age, his gem half will cease to exist as well. I know there's some theories out there that when Steven passes of old age, Pink Steven will emerge and keep going, yet you have to remember that both of them make up Steven, and he was only on the verge of death here because of how his gem responded to his state of mind. Pearl even believes that being half human gives him an expiration date. Sure, he could live for thousands of years, but the day will still come where Steven Universe passes away. When Steven is on his deathbed, his elderly body will communicate to his gem that it's time to go, or maybe reboot into a new identity that's different from both Pink Diamond and Steven, kinda like the Avatar of gems. The events of Steven the Sword Fighter are another deeply traumatic event for Steven, as he basically witnessed Pearl die, getting stabbed in the back by her own Hollow Pearl that stayed behind after she poofed, which may have delayed Pearl's regeneration. I know Pearl takes her time reforming, but I always felt like that was open-ended. Regardless, we're lucky that things shook out in Steven and Pearl's favor, as it's likely Hollow Pearl could have killed both of them if circumstances were different. The fact she even poofed her creator shows that Hollow Pearls aren't designed to go easy on comrades. After all, they were likely utilized the most during the Gem War. Their opponents were trying to shatter them, so I don't find it too far-fetched that Hollow Pearl's capable of the same thing. We know Pearl isn't above going for the gem after all, and Pearl says in Sworn to the Sword that Hollow Pearl was recalibrated to be less lethal since she was training 2 human kids. There's a timeline where Steven reacted differently to Hollow Pearl, trying to best her in combat instead of just trying, and that would have caused Hollow Pearl to continue the fight and put Steven 6 feet under. I do think Garnet and Amethyst's presence also gave Steven some extra protection, as they would have cleared Hollow Pearl if she tried to hurt him. But if they had their hands tied elsewhere, dealing with a corrupted gem or just goofing off around town while Pearl trained Steven solo, forget about it! They're both dead! And Pearl getting killed means that the truth about Pink Diamond is never revealed. Lion 2 the movie saw Steven and Connie activate a training robot in Rose's armory that shot deadly element-based projectiles. This robot pursued them after they retreated to Beach City, and they were only able to stop it because Lion summoned Rose's sword at the perfect moment. This was insanely lucky. If Lion was struck before he summoned the sword, or just didn't manifest it in a short amount of time, there would have been no way for Steven and Connie to stop the robot, as Steven wasn't adept at summoning his shield. Even when they had the sword, they could have messed up any of these swings and gotten themselves killed. No one was around to help them. Well, except like Jane, but what is she gonna do? Steven, and especially Connie getting killed, would land the gems in hot water for leaving them unsupervised. It would become a huge story in the news, and they might have even gotten exiled from Beach City, gems being branded as a threat, and leading to the government keeping a closer eye on them. An indirect kiss recounts another severely traumatic event for Steven, as Amethyst cracked her gem and was on the verge of shattering unless Steven found a way to heal her. And he didn't realize that his healing powers worked differently from his mother's, possessing healing spit instead of healing tears. Rose's fountain seemed to activate in response to Steven's emotional distress, which to me says that timing was kind of everything here. There's a timeline where Steven didn't react the way he did when he did, Amethyst would have been doomed as the fountain wouldn't have activated. Amethyst alone kicking the bucket has long-term ramifications, as Steven and Peridot wouldn't have been able to defeat Jasper down the road, since Smoky Quartz couldn't have existed. Amethyst no longer being in the picture also means that the gems wouldn't have been able to escape the zoo unscathed, as the Amethyst wouldn't have viewed the crystal gems favorably, opting to stop the gems from escaping out of fear of retaliation from Holly Blue Agate. The whole script would have been flipped. Ocean Gem has a couple of bad ending timelines that are worth exploring. Right off the bat, there's already a scenario where Greg took too long to hop into the van when Lapis was drowning Connie, causing the poor girl to get killed. I also imagine if Steven's healing powers failed when Lapis relied on them, she may have gotten enraged and resumed the battle, overwhelming the team. Let's also imagine a timeline where Steven didn't have the kind of relationships he had with the crystal gems, but instead, their dynamic was more akin to Pink and the Diamonds, where he was definitely neglected and treated as an inferior. Maybe Greg's not around to instill empathetic life lessons onto Steven. That all would lead to Steven treating Lapis's mirror differently, getting frustrated whenever Lapis chooses not to speak through the mirror, verbally mistreating the mirror, and pulling Lapis's gem out in an attempt to get the mirror to work. Kinda like blowing on a video game cartridge that won't load. But before he can put the gem back into the mirror, it shatters and frees Lapis, where she would have pulled the same scheme to get back to Homeworld and walk away from the battle as the clear winner, bringing the bubble crystal gems back with her to prove her innocence. Space Race is another episode where Steven experiences a traumatic event, and there's absolutely a timeline where things went from bad to worse for him. Steven and Pearl are in grave danger as their makeshift spaceship begins to fall apart as they approach the edge of Earth's atmosphere. There's a world where Pearl didn't listen to Steven's plea to abandon ship, or came to her senses when it was already too late, leading to the two getting caught in the implosion, which Greg would have witnessed, traumatizing him for life. Once again, no Steven pretty much dooms the crystal gems when it comes to both the diamonds and the cluster. No Pearl means the truth about Pink Diamond never comes to light. And no hitting the subscribe button means you won't stay in the loop with all things animation. And that would be tragic. Avoid that timeline at all costs. Island Adventure. If Lars and or Sadie were killed by the invisible gem terrorizing them on Mask Island, Lars would have never been taken to Homeworld, which means the off-colors would have wound up shattered in the abandoned kindergarten, and Stevani would have never been to the Jungle Moon, potentially causing Steven to never find out the truth about his mom. That's right, Lars is a pretty vital character. It sounds silly, but there's a timeline where the events of Watermelon Steven ended in certain death for Garnet, Amethyst, and Pearl. The crystal gems were getting pummeled by the Watermelon Stevens, and the violence only stopped because of Baby Melon's sacrifice. If it wasn't for him, the crystal gems would have been reduced to shards. Now you may be thinking, the Watermelon Stevens can't be that strong because they couldn't even touch Malachite. But let's not forget, not only do fusions get a noticeable boost in strength, but Malachite in particular is a fusion of two pretty powerful gems. I mean, does her size not speak for herself? You could argue the gems could have just fused into Malachite against the Watermelons if the situation was that dire, and I agree. But from what we saw in the episode, the melons were keeping them separated, which prevented the chance for Alexandrite to form. Don't mess with the melons, man. Warp Tour is worth touching on, as although the gems weren't in any mortal danger, Steven dying prior to the events of this episode would have an insane impact on the timeline. Peridot restoring the galaxy warp would have never been detected by the gems, which means Homeworld would have had instant access to the planet, and the crystal gems would have never learned about the cluster. More Homeworld gems may have arrived on the planet to investigate the status of the cluster and the presence of any remaining crystal gems, which obviously wouldn't have worked out in the team's favor. They barely managed to evade Homeworld in the proper timeline with the few advantages they had. But also consider, if Steven dies at any point after Ocean Gem but before Warp Tour, Homeworld would have interrogated Lapis and could have brought more gems with them. The episode Future Vision is one of those super morbid, yet absolutely hilarious episodes, as Garnet foresees the many ways in which Steven could die throughout it. Choking to death on fry bits, falling down manholes, food poisoning, wasp stings, all possible futures that Garnet foresees, yet Steven avoids.
Do I choke on a pickle?
You don't choke on a pickle.
That means something else happens with the pickle!
But the most significant one would have to be at the very end of this episode. If Garnet didn't have a moment of vulnerability, something that stemmed from the growth of their relationship, Steven would have been struck by lightning and died, which means Garnet probably would have never came out of her shell. And since gems are supercomputers at their core, and Yellow Diamond's aura and destabilization blasts resemble electricity, I do wonder if a lightning strike could completely fry a gem and prevent them from working properly. And in Steven's case, it would just straight up kill him. Pretty bad. Winter Forecast also showcases multiple timelines where Steven, Connie, and Greg die in car accidents while trying to get Connie home during a snowstorm, including one where they crash into Connie's dad, Doug. All these end up being future visions that Garnet passed on to Steven, but it's crazy how many times he evaded death from scenarios that are both grounded in reality and are very obviously ungrounded. Call him Hannah Montana because he has the worst of both worlds. The Return is another episode of a timeline that's a pretty straightforward bad ending. If Steven didn't use his shield at the right time against the hand ship's blast, the entire team would have been obliterated. The cluster then emerges a couple of months later, and the Earth is doomed. As for Jailbreak, if Garnet didn't get the chance to reform, or if she lost a fight with Jasper, the Crystal Gems wouldn't have been able to take control of the situation. Instead, they would have been taken to Homeworld, put on trial in front of the Diamonds, and swiftly sentenced to shattering. And the truth about Pink Diamond would have never been revealed. Friendship saw Garnet and Pearl reconcile after the Sardonyx fiasco in a moment where they really needed to patch things up, lest they be killed by Peridot's trap. In a timeline where they never patched things up and got shattered in the ship, Alexandrite would have never been formed against Malachite, and Steven would have had a much harder time catching Peridot. Odds are, this is another timeline where the cluster forms and the Earth is destroyed. Message received. Yellow Diamond detonating the communicator probably could have killed everyone if they didn't dispose of it in time. Of course, the cluster wasn't dealt with yet, so the Earth is
gone.
It's wild to think about, but if the events of Watermelon Steven didn't unfold the way they did, we would have seen the bad timeline for Super Watermelon Island. You see, Alexandrite only won the battle against Malachite because the Watermelon Stevens managed to distract the toxic fusion momentarily. The Crystal Gems were on the verge of losing prior to this intervention. Again, I love how Steven is always the key to survival in some way, shape, or form. His influence is felt throughout the entire story. With Alexandrite defeated, Malachite finishes them off right then and there. As a result, Lapis and Jasper never unfuse. With Jasper's influence, the fusion doubles down and goes on a rampage across Earth until Lapis is able to regain control. If she ever does. The Ruby Squad would arrive in the following days in search of Jasper. Knowing they stand no chance against the fusion, they opt to alert Yellow Diamond about Malachite's existence, accusing Lapis of forcing Jasper into the fusion and keeping the kindergarten courts who could in a hostage situation, which isn't too far off from the truth. In response, Yellow Diamond comes to Earth and separates the fusion apart by force, sentencing Lapis to shattering and retrieving the cluster, destroying the Earth in the process. On the topic of the cluster, let's talk about the bad ending timeline for Gem Drill. In this timeline, Steven fails to communicate with the cluster and help them form a bubble. He and Peridot likely would have been killed as it formed. I imagine the whole body also would have formed instead of just an arm, so chances are, the Crystal Gems wouldn't have been able to take it on without Obsidian, and they would have gotten themselves shattered, dooming humanity and the planet. Steven Floats is a pretty comical episode, but there's a timeline where his greatest fears came to fruition, where, if he was unable to get a grip on his powers and descend, he would have starved to death and have his remains rain upon Beach City. Also consider all the horrific things that could have happened while he was trapped in the sky, colliding with an airplane, getting struck by lightning, and so on. Despite the jokes, this was a pretty horrific situation for the kid to be in. Alone at Sea has a pretty straightforward bad ending timeline. Jasper was determined to shatter Steven, as she believed Steven was getting in the way of Malachite's rebirth. If it wasn't for Lapis coming in with the Smash Bros finisher, Greg would have seen his son get murdered before his very eyes. And if Lapis had come to Jasper's plea for fusion, the entire boat could have been destroyed with Greg and Steven on board, which, at the very least, would have killed Greg. Moral of the story? Be glad Lapis is on our side. Crack the Whip saw Amethyst give it her all to defeat Jasper, only to be overwhelmed by the devastating combo of strength and shit-talking. There's a timeline where if Stefani didn't spring into action in the nick of time, Jasper would have finished what she started and shattered Amethyst into pieces. Stefani wouldn't have held back after defeating Jasper, poofing her instead of letting her retreat. But again, no Amethyst means no bond with the Famethyst. It's a certified bad ending. Bismuth vs. Steven was one of the most stressful moments in the entire series, and if Steven didn't strike Bismuth with Rose's sword, she likely would have shattered him with the breaking point, destroying his gem and ending his life, removing any hope for the corrupted gems to be healed or for the diamonds to end their tyranny. But this timeline gets messier. If Bismuth comes back for the gems and tries to hide Steven's death or owns up to it, it's not ending well for her. For Bismuth to be the one who survives this fight, she's not walking away with any meaningful character development. She'll just double down on her beliefs that Rose is Steven and Rose is a monster. Imagine her explaining that rationale to gems who know Steven isn't Rose. They'd be disturbed and devastated, which would inevitably spiral into a fight. Any outcome would be pretty disastrous. I do think there's a slim chance she could best all 3 gems and give them an ultimatum: comply or die. To which I see the 3 obviously choosing death, getting shattered by the breaking point. If the gems overwhelm Bismuth and manage to poof her, they're still pretty screwed about Steven, being forced to bide their time before the diamonds inevitably do them in, while also mourning the loss of family and a friend. Bubbled. There's a timeline where Eyeball manages to kill Steven in space before removing his gem from his lifeless body, causing her to realize that she's made a grave mistake as she's holding the gem of Pink Diamond. From there, the crystal gems might find Eyeball the roaming eye, horrified to discover that Steven has been murdered before tossing the ruby back into space. The sight of Pink Diamond's gem would cause Garnet and Amethyst to piece everything together, which would allow Pearl to break her vow of silence and explain why Pink Diamond invented the persona of Rose Quartz. Eyeball and the rubies would manipulate the crystal gems into returning to Homeworld, claiming that Eyeball would own up to murdering Pink Diamond. However, Eyeball would obviously betray them, accusing the crystal gems of holding on to Pink Diamond's remains, and that she was just lucky enough to retrieve it. The diamonds, buying the ruby story, shatter Garnet, Amethyst, and Pearl, and take Pink Diamond's gem, rebooting it into a new incarnation that they try to assume control over once again. That's dark. Know Your Fusion almost led to one of the more absurd timelines where the crystal gems perish. If they failed to exit Sardonic's room before it collapsed, they likely would have ceased to exist alongside it. The only way to recreate the room would be to have Sardonyx fusing, which can't happen if Garnet and Pearl are wiped from existence. So the core team, gone in a flash. Which is pretty wild to think about, and also makes the temple feel like a bit of a death trap. But on that note, would y'all be interested in a full video on the temple and the lore behind gem rooms, where I try to make sense of it all? Let me know in the comments down below. In the episode Steven's Dream, Garnet originally foresaw a timeline where she went with Steven to Korea and was spotted by Blue Diamond. This led to Blue Diamond hunting down the other crystal gems to their home base, and judging by their battle and reunited, they wouldn't have stood a chance. Blue Diamond would have either shattered them herself, especially once she recognized Garnet from thousands of years ago, or she would have brought the gems back to Homeworld so they could be publicly humiliated and sentenced to a shattering. That will be all as where the gems were really playing with fire by escaping the zoo while the diamonds were still at that exact location. There's gotta be timelines where Steven and Greg slipped up while leaving the bubble room, getting recognized by the diamonds, or where Sapphire's anxiety got the best of her and exposed her position. Honestly, I think Yellow would have just shattered them on the spot, especially with emotions already being high in this moment. Let me also once again bring up that if Amethyst wasn't in the picture, the Amethyst probably wouldn't have been looking out for them, and thus sided with Holly Blue Agate. Also, if Blue Diamond discovered that Greg was actually with the crystal gems, she might have killed him personally, as she would have seen the alignment as a betrayal, regretting opening up to Greg when she was in Korea, before, abducting him. Let's shift gears to timelines revolving around Lars and the off-colors. If it wasn't for Lars' sacrifice, something that was the accumulation of his arc, the shattering Robonoids would have overwhelmed Steven and the off-colors, eventually taking all of them out. Lars never dying and being brought back to life means that Steven could never escape Homeworld. He would have died on this planet without ever seeing his friends and family again. Then there's Lars the Stars and Jungle Moon. If Lars and the Off-Colors had stolen any other ship or dealt with any other Emerald, the ship they were on would have been blown to smithereens instead of Emerald intentionally missing it because of her connection with the vehicle. Stefani's also extremely lucky that they survived the ship crashing into the Jungle Moon, as there are numerous points where their life was at stake. Steven dying at any point during Season 5 means that you can kiss the Healed Gems and Era 3 goodbye. Now let's tackle the bad timeline for Reunited, as it's truly insane how a very specific set of circumstances led to the Crystal Gems coming out of their battle with Blue and Yellow Diamond alive. Their entire key to survival was the information that Rose Quartz was really Pink Diamond. Let's say Steven never went to the moon base. This event never occurring is pretty much a death sentence for the entire planet. If Ronaldo never woke up Steven to tell him about the barn on the moon, Steven would have would never had that dream flashback that caused him to put Pearl on the spot about what really happened when Pink Diamond was shattered. This means Ruby and Sapphire never would have split up, they never would have gotten married, which means Bismuth would have never been unbubbled, weakening the team in numbers, and preventing the Diamond Hand ships from being repaired if the gems somehow survived the battle. Yet, the Diamonds still would have shown up regardless for both the cluster and the chance to confront the Crystal Gems. No moon-based visit also means Lapis would have never shown up to the brawl, even if she saw the Diamonds head to Earth all the way from the moon base. She wouldn't have had that cathartic talk with Steven that persuaded her to come back home. And Lapis was pivotal in keeping Blue Diamond at bay, even if they were still unable to do much to her in the long run. It's safe to say that the Crystal Gems would have lost the battle much sooner, and even if Yellow Diamond still KO'd Steven and sent him to the Mindscape, what is he going to do if he doesn't know that he can sway them to his side? Everyone would have gotten their asses kicked and subsequently killed. And let's say Steven still went to the moon base, but when he confronted Pearl, he still didn't learn the truth for one reason or another. I think the only thing that changes is Lapis finding the courage to show up in Brawl. As long as Steven doesn't know that he has Pink Diamond's gem, the outcome will never be in their favor. Change Your Mind had a few close calls for our heroes. Let's say Steven's gambit of fusing with the gems to save them failed. All their gemstones would have dropped to the ground and shatter on impact. And if Sunstone didn't form when they did, everyone would have been crushed by the Diamond Mech. There's also Steven being thrown on the brink of death after White Diamond pulled out his gem. If his human and gem half didn't fuse back together in time, his human half would have died. But would his gem half die? Well, I do suspect that his gem relies on his human half to an extent, evident with Gem Steven being devoid of any personality. While there is a chance Gem Steven would have just continued to exist as an unstoppable force who travels the world emotionless in search of a new purpose, there's also a chance that after a while, his form just collapses and the gemstone is unable to generate a new form. It relied on Steven's human half to function, which is why the two halves desperately sought after fusing back together to survive. But let's say the gem half could survive on its own. What if White managed to zap Pink Steven? Well, while I don't think she can make a White Steven mold their image to Pink Diamond, I do think she could utilize the gem half as a powerful weapon to conquer new planets and prevent gems from stepping out of line, turning Steven into something that goes against everything he stands for. The Crystal Gems would remain under White's influence for the foreseeable future, being used as examples for what could happen if you choose to defy Homeworld's rules. Again, dark. Of course, I gotta talk about Steven Universe the movie, as it's very easy to identify a timeline where Steven never had his epiphany, and his words to Spinel fell on deaf ears. He was already weak and drained himself the more he used his powers, appearing physically ill. So it wouldn't have taken much for Spinel to beat the remaining life out of him and destroy the planet, killing countless lives in the process. In the aftermath, if she didn't go down with the planet, she more than likely would have been destroyed by the Diamonds, who re-enter the cycle of grief, slowly reversing all the progress made on Homeworld. Of course, we can't forget that Sapphire foresaw a future where Ruby was shattered during the destruction of Bismuth's scaffolding, a devastating loss that probably would have derailed Steven's whole mission to return the gems back to normal, which would have ensured Earth's demise at the hands of Spinel and her injector. Winding down, we have Volleyball, which almost saw a bad ending where the two Pearls were rejuvenated by the show. Now, this wouldn't have been as much of a death sentence for Pearl, as we know she can get her memory back, but I think Volleyball would have been a lost cause. She essentially would have been reborn as another Pearl designed to serve Pink Diamond in particular, which would have driven Steven crazy. Last but not least, we have I Am My Monster. If Connie never convinced everyone to give Steven the reassurance he needed, he would have never turned back to normal. Committing to the role of the monster, he destroys Beach City. Their best solution would have been another powerful fusion that involves Lapis, so that they can restrain him underwater for as long as possible, keeping their Godzilla in a cage. Which would have been a very depressing ending for Steven, losing his sense of self and being denied freedom by the same people he helped in their journey of self-discovery. And if he ever breaks free, the planet wouldn't have much time before it was demolished. Our beloved hero going down in infamy as a villain. A force of disaster. And there you have it, every timeline where the Crystal Gems either lost a battle or their lives. Do you agree with these scenarios, or do you envision something a little different? Let us know in the comments down below, and keep the conversation going over on Instagram and Twitter at AwestruckVox and at Roundtable Vids. Shout out to Jakey Bones for another bigger thumbnail. Please give him a follow on Twitter at JakeyBone. And if you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe to the Roundtable for more great Steven Universe content. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have an awesome day. Peace!